Alpha, what is it you see? Tell me.
We are not alone, Erewa. Prepare yourself.
No, the signs, not here.
They have found us.
She had washed other people's clothes her entire life. Her hands were cracked. Her back was bent. Her name meant nothing to anyone. But one man saw a scar on her face and ran. A blind woman heard her voice and wept, and a king who had not smiled in 20 years fell to his knees in the mud. What was carved into that woman's skin that made the powerful tremble? Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Listen closely, because this is not just a story about a poor woman. This is a story about what happens when the truth that powerful people buried alive begins to breathe again. It was a morning like 100 mornings before it. The sun had not yet fully risen above the hills, and the river Ouse already carried its cold, dark water between the rocks, indifferent and ancient. Along its bank, a woman knelt. Her name was Erewa. She was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had carved lines into her face that made her seem older. She wore a faded wrapper the color of dried clay, and her arms moved through the water with a slow, practiced rhythm of someone who had been doing this since she was old enough to carry a bucket. She was washing, always washing, other people's clothes, other people's linens, other people's children's garments. Her hands were rough as tree bark. Her knees bore the permanent purple bruises of a woman who spent her days on stone. And around her on the riverbank, the village moved and talked and laughed, but not with her. Around her was a silence that was its own kind of cruelty, the silence of people who have decided that a person is not worth seeing. Erewa did not complain. She never complained. She worked, and when she was done working, she walked home to her small room behind the market, cooked whatever little she had, and slept. That was her life. Every day the same. Every morning the same cold river, the same cracked hands, the same invisible woman on the bank. But this morning was different. This morning, something was coming toward that river. Something that had been coming for 20 years without knowing it. Let us know Erewa more deeply, because she deserves to be known. She lived alone. She had always lived alone. There was no mother she could remember, no father whose face she had ever seen. She had come to this village, the village of Agoro, as a small child, carried in the arms of an old market woman named Mama Tola, who had since died. Mama Tola had told Erewa only this about her past. You came to me wrapped in a cloth at the edge of a burning road. I do not know whose child you are. I only know you were crying, and I could not walk past a crying child. That was all Erewa had. A burning road, a stranger's arms, and a crescent-shaped scar on her left cheek, pale, smooth, shaped like the new moon that she had carried since the very beginning. She did not know where it came from. She had stopped asking. In Agoro, she was tolerated but not embraced. People brought their laundry and left coins without meeting her eyes. The children called her the River Woman. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. She was a fixture, like the mango tree by the well, useful, unnoticed, what no one in Agoro truly saw. What they might have seen if they had ever looked was the quiet dignity with which Erewa moved through her life. She never stole. She never borrowed without returning. When old Baba Segun fell ill last Harmattan season, it was Erewa who brought him hot pepper soup every evening, though he had never once said her name. With warmth, when the river flooded and the children's school bags were ruined, Erewa gave the last of her savings to replace the youngest child's books. A child whose mother had never once greeted her. She gave without expecting return. She endured without growing bitter. And every night she would sit at the small window of her room, look out at the dark sky, and feel, not sadness exactly, but a hollow space inside her chest. as though something important was missing. As though she was a story that had been started but not yet told. She did not know what she was missing, but it was missing all the same. Now, into this quiet, unseen life came a man on a horse. His name was Odufa, and he was about to make the worst mistake of his life. Odufa arrived in Agoro the way powerful men always arrive in small places, loudly, and with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once been told no. He was the chief messenger of Oba Adiyinka, king of the great kingdom of Iresi. His wrapper was deep indigo. His sandals were tooled leather, and the rings on his fingers caught the morning sun as he rode. He carried papers from the palace, some tax matter, some boundary question, and he was stopping at Agoro only because his horse needed water. He rode to the river. He saw the woman kneeling on the bank. He stopped. Now, what happened next was small in one way and enormous in another. It was the kind of small cruelty that powerful people commit without thinking because they have never been required to think. Odufa looked down at Arawa from his horse. He looked at her cracked hands, her faded wrapper, the soap foam on her arms. He looked at her the way one looks at a stone in the road. As an obstacle, perhaps, or simply as something beneath consideration. And then he spoke loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "Woman," he said, his voice carrying the lazy arrogance of a man who expects laughter. "Is this what you do? You wash other people's dirt at the river like a lizard in the mud? Has life truly nothing better for you?" The crowd on the bank rippled. Some people laughed. Some looked away in embarrassment. A few children giggled. Arawa did not look up immediately. She continued wringing a cloth. Then, slowly, she raised her eyes to the man on the horse. Her face was still. Her eyes were clear. "I do my work with clean hands," she said simply. "Can you say the same?" The crowd went quiet. Someone sucked in their breath. Odufa's face darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, and then he stopped, because Arawa had leaned forward to wring the cloth more tightly. And in that movement, the morning light fell full across her face. And there it was, the crescent scar, pale, smooth, shaped like the new moon, small and precise, on the curve of her left cheek, just below the eye, where a tear would fall. The color left Odufa's face so fast it was, as though someone had poured cold water through his skin from the inside. His hands tightened on the reins. His eyes locked on that scar with an expression that was not arrogance anymore. It was something much more complicated than arrogance. It was recognition. It was dread. What? He started. He stopped himself. He looked at the scar again. He looked at Arawa's face. He looked at the scar. Then, without another word, without collecting his papers, without watering his horse, without the dignity he had arrived with, Odufa turned that horse around and rode out of Agoro at full gallop. The crowd stared after him. Arawa stared after him. The water moved quietly in the river. And somewhere in the old part of the village, behind a door that was almost never opened, a blind woman raised her head from her mat, as though she had heard something she had been waiting 20 years to hear. The rest of that day passed strangely for Arawa. People who had been ignoring her all morning now watched her from a distance, whispering. She heard the word scar more than once. She heard messenger and fled, and what did he see? She kept her head down and worked until the sun began to sink behind the hills, then packed her things into her basin and walked back through the village market toward her small room. The market smelled of palm oil and smoked fish. Children ran between the stalls. A woman was frying akara, and the hot oil smell mixed with the evening air in a way that was comforting and ordinary. Arawa breathed it in. She needed ordinary tonight. She needed the world to be small and predictable, because something in her chest had been unsettled since Odufa's eyes had found that scar, and she could not name the feeling. she ate alone. Boiled yam with a thin, egusi stew. The kerosene lamp threw small, warm shadows across the wall. Outside, a night bird called once and went silent. Then came the knock at the door. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. The knock of someone who had walked a long way and knew the door would open. Arawa opened it. The woman standing there was ancient. She was perhaps 80, perhaps older. It was impossible to say, the way it is impossible to say the age of a very old tree. She was small and thin, her wrapper the faded blue of sky before rain. Her eyes were milky white, completely white, the eyes of someone who had been blind for many years. She carried a walking stick of smooth dark wood, and she stood in the doorway with a stillness that was somehow more present, more alert, than most sighted people Arawa had ever met. "Iyami," Arawa said, for this was the old blind woman, Iyami, who lived on the edge of the village near the old silk cotton tree. "How did you find my door in the dark?" "I have always known where your door was," the old woman said. "I was waiting for the right night to knock on it." They sat across from each other in the small room, the lamp between them. Iyami's white eyes did not move, but Arawa felt, strangely, as though she was being seen more completely than she had ever been seen in her life. "I heard what happened at the river today," Iyami said. "The man was rude," Arawa said. "And then he left. He left because of what he saw on your face. It is just a scar on my face. It is not just a scar." Iyami's voice was very quiet. "Nothing about you has ever been just anything, child. But there are things I must tell you carefully, and you must hear them carefully. Because once a truth of this size is spoken, it cannot be made small again." Arawa felt the hollow space in her chest again, that missing thing, that untold story, and for the first time in her life she felt it shift as though it were about to open. Tell me," she said. Iyami was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the night bird called again. 20 years ago, the old woman began, the kingdom of Iresi had a queen. Her name was Adunola, which means, in the old tongue, the crown gathers sweetness. She was young when she married the king Adiyenka, and she was beloved, not for her beauty, though she was beautiful, but for her goodness. She walked through the markets without guards. She knew the children's names. She listened when the farmers spoke of their troubles. The people did not just respect her, they loved her. Arawa listened without speaking. The lamplight moved. Adunola and the king had a child, Iyami continued. A daughter, born in the dry season. The child was healthy, strong. They had her marked, as was the tradition for royal children of the house of Iresi, a small crescent cut into the left cheek, sealed with the royal oil, so that no matter where in the world that child went, she could always be known as belonging to the blood of the king. The lamplight seemed to dim, though Arawa had not touched it. Her left hand moved, without her meaning it to, toward her own cheek. "There was a fire," Iyami said, "in the palace, a fire that began in the night, in the season of storms, when the king was away. The fire moved through 3 wings of the palace before it was controlled. And when it was over, the queen was dead, the child was gone. The king returned to ash and silence, and he has lived in that silence ever since." "What are you telling me?" Arawa's voice was barely above a whisper. "I am telling you what I know," Iyami said. "I was a servant in that palace once, before these eyes failed me. I carried that baby in my arms on the night of the fire. I ran as far as I could, and when the smoke became too thick, I gave the child to the first kind face I found on the road, a market woman heading south, a woman I knew only as honest and good. And I went back." Her voice faltered. "I went back because I thought I could save the queen. I could not." She reached out across the lamp. Her ancient hand, dry as parchment, moved through the air with surprising certainty and found Arawa's face. Her fingers, trembling, traced the smooth ridge of the crescent scar on her cheek. For a long moment, the old woman was completely still. Then, slowly, she bowed her head and she began to weep. "It is the mark," she whispered. "It is exactly the mark. I would know it if I were dead, Arawa." She said the name differently now, heavier, reverential. "Your name is not Arawa. Your name, the name your mother sang over you before she died, was Ayinde." The world did not shake. The earth did not open. The night bird outside made no sound. And yet everything changed. In that small room, with a kerosene lamp between a washerwoman and a weeping old blind woman, 20 years of buried truth surfaced like something vast rising from the bottom of a river. Arawa, Ayinde, sat perfectly still. Tears ran down her face and she did not move to wipe them. She was thinking of all the mornings on her knees on stone. She was thinking of cracked hands. She was thinking of all the people who had looked through her. She was thinking of Mama Tola, who had carried her away from a burning road and loved her in the only way she knew. And she was thinking of a father, a king, who had not smiled in 20 years. Arawa did not sleep that night. She sat by her window until the sky turned from black to gray to the thin pink of early morning. She sat with Iyami's words moving through her like slow water through stone. She did not leap to believe. She was not a woman given to dramatic hope. Life had not taught her that luxury. She turned the story over and over, the way she turned cloth in the river, looking for weaknesses, looking for places where it might fall apart. But the scar was real. It had always been real, and Mama Tola, God rest her, had told her the truth about a burning road, had never lied to her about the uncertainty of her origins, had never invented a comfortable story. That honesty, which had sometimes felt like cruelty, now felt like a gift. In the morning she went to Mama Tola's old house, which now belonged to Mama Tola's younger sister, a stout woman named Auntie Bisi. "I need to look through Mama Tola's things," Arawa said. "I need to see if she kept anything from when she found me." Auntie Bisi looked at her for a long time. "I always wondered about you," she said finally. "Come." The room smelled of old cloth and camphor. Auntie Bisi pulled out a wooden box from under the narrow bed. Old, the wood dried and cracking at the seams. She set it on the floor and stepped back. "She told me once," Auntie Bisi said, "that there was something in that box she could not explain and could not throw away. She said it came with you. I never opened it after she died. I don't know why. I just couldn't." Arawa knelt on the floor, once again on her knees, though now the stones were not cold river rock but warm wooden floorboards. She lifted the lid. Inside, beneath 2 folded wrapping cloths, was a piece of torn fabric, not just any fabric. The pattern on it, though faded, though torn at one edge, was unmistakable. Deep crimson and gold thread, woven in the overlapping diamond pattern of the royal house of Iresi. Arawa had seen that pattern before distantly, on the ceremonial cloth of the king's messengers who passed through Agoro during festivals. Her hands trembled. She lifted the cloth carefully. Beneath it, wrapped in a smaller piece of plain cotton, was a locket, small oval, made of gold that had darkened with age. She turned it over. On the back, engraved in script so fine she had to bring it close to the lamp, a crescent moon, identical in shape to the scar on her cheek. She opened it. Inside, a tiny portrait. A woman, young, beautiful, her face in profile, her head wrapped in a crown of woven gold threads. Beneath the portrait, a single word, engraved in the old script, Adenola. Arawa stared at the portrait for a very long time. The woman in the locket had her cheekbones. The woman in the locket had the precise shape of her jaw. The woman in the locket looked like Arawa, the way a river looks like its source. Different in size, different circumstance, but unmistakably, undeniably the same water. "Auntie Bisi," Arawa said. Her voice was completely steady. "Do you know anyone who has gone to the palace of Iresi? Anyone who could carry a message?" "What message?" Auntie Bisi asked very quietly. "Tell him," she said, "that the crescent moon has been found." Now, while Arawa was finding the locket, Odufa had already reached the palace at Iresi. He had ridden through the night. He went directly to the room of the king's chief advisor, the man who had, 20 years ago, managed the investigation into the fire, the man who had declared the queen dead and the child gone, and sealed the matter with official documents before the king's grief had cleared enough for him to ask harder questions. That man's name was Reginald Osei. "You are certain of the scar?" Reginald said. "I am certain," Odufa said, "and no one else saw you react to it. People saw me leave. They did not know why." "Good," Reginald said. "Good." He stood and walked to the window. "This woman? She is poor? She is a washerwoman. She lives alone. She has nothing." Reginald nodded slowly. "No one will believe a washerwoman," Reginald said, as though this were a comfort. "But the scars can be explained. Scars can be dismissed." Reginald turned from the window. His eyes were very flat. "Let me handle this. You will say nothing to the king. Nothing. Do you understand me?" Odufa understood. He understood too much. He sat in that chamber for a long time after Reginald left, and the guilt moved through him like the river moves through Agoro. Quietly, constantly, wearing everything down. But the truth is patient in a way that powerful men never account for. Word travels in West Africa, not through official channels, but through the mouths of market women, through the ears of traders, through the casual conversations of people who do not realize they are carrying history. Within 3 days, the story of the river woman and the fleeing messenger had traveled from Agoro to 2 neighboring villages, and from there to the ears of a young court musician at Iresi who happened to know Auntie Bisi's nephew. And from that musician, the story reached the only person in the palace who had spent 20 years waiting to hear anything at all, about the lost child. It reached King Adeyinka himself. The king was a tall man, still broad through the shoulders, but grief had bent him slightly, the way weight bends a strong branch over time. He was 54 years old, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had learned to live without hope, but had never made peace with it. When the musician whispered to him in the garden, a washerwoman, a crescent scar, a messenger who fled, the king stood very still. Then he turned to his guards. "Bring Reginald Osei to me now." The confrontation happened in the throne room. "There is a woman in Agoro," the king said. His voice was quiet. "A washerwoman with a crescent scar on her left cheek." "Rumors travel, my king. The world is full of scars." Odufa saw it, and Odufa ran. "Why would my own messenger run from a washerwoman's scar?" "Odufa is superstitious. You know this." "Then I will go to Agoro myself," the king said. Something shifted in Reginald's carefully composed face. Just a flicker. "My king, there is no need. The fire investigations 20 years ago were thorough. The child did not survive." "They were your investigators," the king said. His voice had gone very quiet. "The quietest voices are the most dangerous ones. You chose them. You supervised their work. You brought me their conclusion while I was still unable to stand from grief." He stood up from the throne. He was taller than Reginald by a head. "Did you know, Reginald? All this time, did you know?" A long silence. "I protected you," Reginald said finally. The word protected came out like something rusted and old, a weapon that had been hidden so long it no longer had the shape it once had. "A child, alone, a girl, she would have been used against you. There were enemies at court then who would have taken her and used her as a puppet. I made a decision to—" "You made a decision." The king's voice did not rise. It fell. That was more frightening. "You made a decision to take my daughter from me, To let me grieve for 20 years? To let her grow up? Where? In what condition? You made a decision. My king, you will say nothing more to me." The king turned to his guards. "Reginald Osei will not leave this palace until I return. He will be watched. Every paper in his chambers will be collected." He walked toward the door. He stopped. He did not turn around. The crescent mark is a royal brand. It cannot be counterfeited. It is applied with royal oil at birth upon the left cheek. And the pattern is recorded in the palace birth records, which you did not have access to because they are kept by the high priest. I have already sent for those records. I am told the record of a royal daughter, born in the dry season, marked with the crescent, was registered and never canceled. Then the king walked out. He walked to the stables. He called for his horse. And he rode toward Agoro, not with a guard, not with ceremony, with only 2 men and an urgency that 20 years of waiting will produce in a person when the door they thought was sealed forever is suddenly, terrifyingly open.
If this story is moving you, subscribe now. Hawking. The ending will change how you see everything.
She was at the river. Of course she was at the river. This was where her life had always been, kneeling at the water's edge, hands in the current, working. But this morning was different from every other morning. Iyami sat on the bank behind her. Someone had carried the old woman here at first light. Because Iyami had said only, "I want to be there when it happens." Auntie Bisi stood a little further back, holding the locket in a cloth, and several villagers, who had heard something was coming but did not know what, had gathered at a respectful distance, their voices low. Arawa was washing. She needed to be washing. She needed her hands in the cold water and the familiar weight of wet cloth, because otherwise the trembling in her chest would have overwhelmed her. She had sent word 3 days ago. She did not know if anyone had received it. She did not know if anyone would come. She told herself she had lived 30 years without a father, and she could live 30 more. But her hands trembled in the water, and the trembling was not entirely fear. She heard the horses before she saw them, 2 riders. Then, separating from them, 1 rider alone, coming down the bank toward the river. A tall man on a brown horse. He wore no crown. He wore the plain wrapper of a man who wished not to be announced. But there was something in how he held himself, something in the absolute stillness with which he stopped his horse at the edge of the water and looked across to the woman kneeling on the other side, that made every person on that bank go silent. The king did not speak immediately. He looked at her. He looked at her face, at her mother's cheekbones, at the jaw he had kissed 1,000 times on a woman who was gone, and his hands tightened on the reins, and then loosened, and then tightened again. "Will you stand?" he said. His voice was steady, but barely. Arawa stood. She turned to face him. Her hands were wet. Her wrapper was old. She held herself straight with the dignity of a woman who had learned to carry herself upright when no one else would carry anything for her. "Your face," the king said. His voice broke on the word. "Let me see your face." Arawa did not hesitate. She was done with hesitation. She lifted her face to the light, fully, openly, so that the crescent scar on her cheek was visible in the morning sun. Pale, smooth, small as a sliver of new moon, the king of Iresi, who had governed wars and famines and droughts without losing his composure, who had buried his queen and ruled his kingdom and endured 20 years of unanswered grief, stepped off his horse. He walked into the river. The water soaked his cloth to the knee. He walked until he stood before her, this woman who was not a washerwoman, who had never only been a washerwoman, and he looked at the scar for a long time. Then he reached out and touched it, gently, with one finger, the way one touches a wound that is both unbearable and precious. He said one word, And the sound of it, the sound of her true name spoken by the voice it had been meant to be spoken by first, broke something open in Erwa's chest that had been sealed since before she could remember. The hollow space, the untold story, the missing thing. She did not sob loudly. She made no dramatic sound. She simply came apart, the way a knot comes apart when the right hand pulls the right thread, quietly and completely. And the king of Aresi, her father, stood in the cold river water and held her while she did. And he was weeping too. This great quiet man, weeping without shame in full sight of the village, weeping for the 20 years, for the baby he had been told was gone, for every morning she had spent on her knees on cold stone that she should have spent in a palace. Iyami, on the bank, bowed her ancient head. She was smiling and weeping at the same time. "I carried her," she whispered to no one and everyone. "I carried her that night, and I thought she was lost. She was not lost. She was only waiting." 6 months passed. The palace records confirmed what the scar had always declared. The high priest himself certified the mark against the original registry made at Ayende's birth. Reginald Osi stood before a council of elders and a king with evidence that now spread across 3 tables, documents he had falsified, witnesses he had silenced, a small conspiracy of convenience built to protect his own position during the vulnerable years following the fire. He had not started the fire, but he had used it. He had decided, in the cold calculation of an ambitious man, that a female infant with no power was a smaller loss than the instability he feared. He was stripped of his title, his lands, and his access to the palace. He was not executed. Ayinde herself asked for mercy, and the king granted it. But Reginald Ose spent the rest of his days in the village of his birth, an old man with a reputation that preceded him everywhere he walked. As for Odufa, who had seen the scar and run, who had reported to Reginald first and concealed it from the king, he came forward himself 3 days after the king's arrival in Agoro. He came to Ayinde, not to the king. He stood before her with his rings taken off his fingers and his fine wrapper replaced with plain cloth, and he said, "I am the man who mocked you at the river. I am the man who saw what you were and said nothing. I have no excuse for either thing." Ayinde looked at him for a long time. "You showed me what I needed to see," she said finally. "If you had not come to this river to mock me, your fear would not have moved. Iyami would not have come to my door. The locket would still be in Mama Tola's box." She paused. "You are forgiven for the scar. You will earn forgiveness for the silence by how you live from today." Odufa, it was said afterward, cried harder at those words than any man at any moment in the whole long story. In Agoro, things changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that true changes come slowly and permanently. The people who had looked through Erwa, who was Ayinde, found that looking through a person has a cost that becomes apparent only in retrospect. They came, one by one, in the weeks after the truth was told. They came with different offerings: yams, cloth, words, silence. Ayinde received each of them without cruelty, without satisfaction, without the cold revenge she would have been entitled to. She received them with the dignity that had always been hers, even when no one recognized it. She moved to the palace. She walked its gardens. She sat in the rooms where her mother had sat, and touched the walls that had known her mother's hands, and learned the name of every servant by their first name within a week. She kept the old faded wrapper. She kept the cracked basin. She kept the memory of cold stone beneath her knees, because she understood, in the way only people who have suffered clearly understand, that memory of this kind is not a wound. It is a teacher. It is what ensures that a person who gains power never forgets what power feels like from below. Iyami was brought to the palace with honors, and given a room with warm light and good food, and the king sat with her often in the garden and listened to her remember. She died the following year peacefully in her sleep, with the expression of a woman who had finally set down a weight she had carried for too long and found that rest in the end was very sweet. King Adienka, who had not smiled in 20 years, learned again, slowly, how to smile. It was not the same smile he had worn before the fire. Nothing is ever quite the same after 20 years, but it was real. And his daughter, who had grown up with cracked hands and invisible eyes upon her and a hollow space in her chest. She filled that space, not with a palace or a crown, but with the knowledge of who she was and who had always loved her without knowing she was there. There is a saying among the elders that I will leave you with tonight. They say, "The river does not forget the rain that made it, even when the rain has fallen far away and long ago." Allende had been falling through the world for 30 years, but the river remembered, the blood remembered, the scar remembered, and when the right hand came to the water at the right time, everything that had been separated found its way home. The woman who had washed other people's dirt her whole life turned out to have the cleanest hands in the kingdom. And those who had mocked her at the river knelt before her with their own hands in the same water, wishing they had been wiser, wishing they had looked more carefully, wishing they had known what a crescent scar on a washerwoman's face was quietly, patiently carrying toward its appointed morning. Thank you, friends, for sitting with us tonight for this story. If it moved something in you, if it reminded you that dignity cannot be taken from a person only unrecognized for a time, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel and click the bell so you never miss a story. And watch our next story right here. Until then, may your truth find you as it always, always does.